Good evening, and so thank you for those of you who were here earlier, and for those of you who are joining us for this part of our event. As a product of the American South, I feel a special relationship to the civil rights movement. My parents witnessed firsthand the events of Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, which they in turn tried to shelter my sisters and me from. Even through the loss of my father's friend, Chris McNair's daughter, who died in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And I could go on. And even that, as I later discovered through my marriage, that my mother-in-law was there for the first March on Washington. It seems long ago, but with each opportunity for historians and other scholars to reach back to try to help us understand what happened and to dispel media-driven myths of the movement days. Our memories are refreshed and our knowledge and fortified by new knowledge. This evening, we are very fortunate to have one such historian, Dr. William P. Jones, Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we feel that we are so honored and privileged to have him as our keynote this evening. As we, for our second inaugural Martin Luther King Week lecture. Dr. Jones is a graduate of Northwestern University and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has contributed greatly to our understanding of one of the best-known single events in the history of the civil rights movement, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He is a specialist in civil rights and labor history, or as he describes himself, a historian of the 20th century United States with particular interest in race, class, and work. He is the author of The Tribe of Black Ulysses, African American Lumber Workers in the Jim Crow South. And he received considerable attention last year for his book, The March on Washington, again, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights. Not only was the book reviewed widely in the New York Times by preeminent civil rights historian David Garrell, because of the March 50th anniversary, Dr. Jones received media attention, including an extensive NewsHour interview with Gwen Ifill. Dr. Jones' focus on the role of labor, and in particular A. Philip Randolph, allows us to revisit the narrative about the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that seems to be getting lost over time. As one reviewer observed, Jones cast the march as a triumph of the Black labor movement and affiliated grassroots efforts. This is very important because while we are pleased that in 2014 Dr. King's status has elevated the movement, keeping it fresh in our memories, the work of Dr. Jones and his colleagues remind us of the many African American workers, men and women who made this movement in history possible. Whether on the buses of Washington in August 1963, among the grassroots organizers who rallied people from all over the United States. William's mother was on that bus that came from Philadelphia. Or among people like my parents in the streets and the churches of Birmingham working to act locally. So, my honor and my pleasure to have Dr. Jones here. And by the way, it was my ideal and not Dr. Welburn's to bring him here. So I did that.
Thank you, Janice. I was going to thank William and Janice, but I'll just thank Janice then. William's not even here, so. Oh, and thanks, William. I'm really honored to be here, and It's great to be back in Milwaukee. Janice didn't mention that I taught for 3 years at UWM and still really miss living in this great city. And I've really enjoyed my time here. I've really enjoyed the panel this afternoon, just before this, and hearing about efforts to, here at Marquette, to live up to, I think, the standards that Dr. King set for all of us. Today, this year, Martin Luther King Day, I think, comes in a really important moment in a year-long or 2-year-long series of anniversaries that I think really should give us pause and to think back on a moment 50 years ago that I think in many ways began with the March on Washington in August of 1963, continued through the introduction of the idea of the war on poverty in January of 1964, the passage of the Civil Rights Act just almost a year after the March on Washington in 1963, which is still, I think, rightly remembered as one of the most important laws passed in the United States in the 20th century. So I think what we can do in this series of 50th anniversaries, in this period, starting last August and ending a year from now, is to think back on that historical period, take account of what's happened since then, and what the meaning of these events in our past have for us today. And in the book that I've written really tries to take a very long view of that legacy, going back long before 1963. And there's a number of reasons that I do that. I take that long view, and I want to explain some of them today. And I hope that we can have a conversation about your own thoughts about this history, and what, again, I think what it means is to us going forward. The idea for the March on Washington came from an anonymous black woman in Chicago. And we don't know anything really about her other than that she stood up from the floor at a mass meeting and said, "Mr. Chairman." She was speaking to A. Philip Randolph, the great labor leader. He was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the largest African-American union at the time. And he was widely seen as the most important leader of African-Americans in the United States. She said, "Mr. Chairman, we ought to throw 50,000 Negroes around the White House, bring them from all over the country, in jalopies and trains, and any way they can get there, and keep them there until we can get some action from the president." A. Philip Randolph, as a labor leader, as a lifetime activist in the Socialist Party, thought this was a great idea. And within a few months, he was confident that he could get 100,000 people to join him in a massive march on Washington. They would represent a cross-section of African Americans, as he described them in a newspaper column, Negro laborers, domestics, mechanics, professionals. They would gather at the Capitol building and march down Pennsylvania Avenue past the White House and the War Department and end with a massive rally at the Lincoln Memorial. In Randolph's vision, they would march in brigades representing every state in the nation, and they'd be led by Boy Scouts and veterans of the Great War, and they'd hold banners that read, "Let American Negroes help America, total democracy for total defense, and if we are fit to fight, we are fit to work." They would walk in what Randolph described as a solemn and determined fight for real democracy. Now, if you were paying attention closely, you might have recognized that this was not the March on Washington in 1963 that we're marking the 50th anniversary of. It was actually the first March on Washington, which was called by A. Philip Randolph in 1941 and called off at the last minute, so it never occurred. One clue is the War Department is no longer on that route. It's now in the Pentagon across the river. But one thing that I think is fascinating is how similar that description was to what actually happened 20 years later in 1963. The first march in 1941 was called to protest discrimination in the armed forces. This was before Pearl Harbor, so the US was not actually in the Second World War yet. But the US had started to gear up to supply weapons and equipment for allies in Europe and in Asia. And so the idea was, as then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was that the United States would be an arsenal of democracy by providing the weapons to actually defend democracies from the rising tide of fascism. A. Philip Randolph and other black leaders said that's a great idea, but it's somewhat contradictory in a situation where the armed forces remained segregated and, for the most part, completely exclusionary toward African Americans. And also, perhaps most importantly, the defense industries also remained largely closed to African Americans. So jobs in auto plants, for example, retooled and started producing airplanes in Detroit. Almost all of those jobs were completely closed to African Americans. This was a moment in which the mobilization for the war had essentially ended the Great Depression for people who had access to these industrial jobs. The union movement really took off dramatically within those war plants. And they became a tool for a vehicle for upward mobility that, again, African Americans were completely excluded from. So this created a great deal of protest in 1940 and 1941. There was a movement to defy a draft order, so African American men started to say that they're not going to sign up for the draft. There was a lot of discussion as to how to address this issue, and this was the moment in which this woman in Chicago proposed a massive march on Washington, and in which A. Philip Randolph took it up and started to help to organize it. He called it off at the last minute when one of their most important issues was addressed by an executive order issued by President Roosevelt, which banned discrimination by defense contractors. So Roosevelt actually met a great deal of resistance from within the armed forces. The military brass refused to meet the issue about segregation. But he was able to sign an executive order that essentially said, if you're going to get a federal contract to build weapons, to build equipment, then you have to promise that you will hire people regardless of their race, their religion, their national origin. This was a major victory. This was, at the time, it was compared to the Emancipation Proclamation. And it really was the first time since Reconstruction that the federal government had done anything on behalf of African Americans. I mean, this was a tremendous sort of shift in federal policy, but it was one that was extremely varied and incomplete. For one thing, it did not address the issue of segregation and discrimination in the armed forces. That would not be done until under President Truman in the late 1940s. It wasn't clear how this order would actually be enforced. President Roosevelt created a federal commission called the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, that was charged with upholding this order. He gave it an $80,000 budget, which was not enough to really carry out much. They could hold sort of high-profile hearings in a number of big cities. There was one in New York, one in Chicago, a couple in the Southwest, in California. Perhaps most importantly, it was an emergency order that was issued during the war. And so once the war came to an end, it expired. So it was a very temporary victory. And this set up a 20-year battle that we would come to know as the Civil Rights Movement. In a sense, we can think of this as the beginning of the modern Civil Rights Movement. A. Philip Randolph said, we need to do two things. We need to mobilize at the local level to enforce this order. So we need to identify people who have been discriminated. We need to teach them what their rights are. We need to train them in how to testify before the FEPC. We need to hold demonstrations that can hold the FEPC accountable. If we know of employers that are receiving federal contracts, we need to publicize this. We need to demonstrate and sort of uphold this order that Roosevelt issued but wasn't very clear about how it would be enforced. The other thing we need to do is fight for permanent legislation banning employment discrimination. And this established a 20-year battle that would end only in the inclusion of Title VII in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal to discriminate against somebody in employment on the basis of their race, their national origin, their religion, and in the ultimate law, also on the basis of their gender. And this would actually be a really important part of this evolving story that I'll come back to. So it set up this 20-year battle that in a sense culminated with the historic period that we're now marking the 50th anniversary of. It did a number of things, I think, that we would come to take for granted. It also did things that we've largely forgotten. One, it established A. Philip Randolph as the most important and central leader of the civil rights movement. And this is a position that he would retain through the 1960s, although this position would largely be forgotten. So the March on Washington, for example, in 1963 is often referred to as Martin Luther King's March on Washington. At the time, it was very clear to everybody who was there, to all of the press and the media, that it was A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington. In fact, most people recognized that this was the fulfillment of something that he had proposed 20 years before this. He was known as the Dean of Black Leadership, and that was a slogan that people would use through the 1960s. Another thing that this earlier March on Washington did was it established a link that was actually, I think, a really important and central point to the panel that preceded this talk, the link between racial equality and economic justice, and the idea that the two of those goals could never be achieved in isolation from each other, that in a sense you cannot actually have racial equality unless you have economic justice for all Americans, and that the two go hand in hand. And this would be reflected in the slogan of the March for Jobs and Freedom. So I think there's three reasons we really need to know this long history and what this march means for us today. One is it really, I think, helps us explain and understand the tremendous success of the March on Washington in 1963. This was at the time the largest demonstration in the history of the United States, and it was a tremendous political success. It had a profound impact on the political discussion at the time, and I think we can, it had a really profound impact on federal policy. And so understanding how does this come about, I think, can really only be understood in looking at a very long history, the degree to which this event and this mobilization built on institutions and political connections that were built up over a period of 20 years, in many cases much longer than that, hundreds of years really before that. The 1941 March established a model of mass mobilization that would become sort of central to, and I think often taken for granted in the civil rights movement, to the point that we now, I think, often see this as a sort of spontaneous or natural outgrowth of African American culture, or of American culture even. In contrast, I would argue that this was actually a political strategy and a model of mass mobilization that was not at all sort of intuitive and sort of organic to the United States even. It was very much sort of implemented and perfected over a very long period of time by strategists who thought about it very carefully. The idea of nonviolent mass mobilization was very consciously adopted from what was the ongoing independence movement against British colonialism in India at the time. So in 1941, A. Philip Randolph and other activists were reading newspaper reports about Gandhi in India and saying, wow, this is interesting. We need to study this. We need to understand this. This was actually going on across the country largely among African Americans, but also other people interested in social justice, wondering how can we apply these strategies? How might they be relevant to what we're facing today. It's interesting that in 1941, most African American sort of political leaders thought that this could not be used in the United States. One thing they said was that in India, it was being used by a vast majority of Indians who were trying to get rid of the power of a tiny minority of British colonialists, right? So you try that here, where African Americans are a minority, it will just turn into bloodshed and slaughter. And most of the black press, most of the black leadership actually said, forget it, this is just insane, we're not going to do this. There was one reason that it was particularly attractive to A. Philip Randolph, and that was that he said that it was a type of political mobilization that was inclusive of everybody, that anybody could participate in a mass nonviolent demonstration. At the time, most of the major civil rights organizations, the National Urban League, the NAACP, focused fairly narrowly on two strategies. One was legislative lobbying, right? They went and talked to elected officials. You know, you go to the people who have power if you want to change, if you can change their minds, get them to change the laws. That's the way in which you change things. Another strategy would be take legal cases to the courts, right? And sue people, sue for your rights under the Constitution. And the limitations of both those strategies was that if you're going to go to the court, you should probably be a lawyer, right? You should know something about the Constitution. If you're going to go and talk to elected officials, it helps if you are very well educated. It helps that you're an adult, right? If you're looking for people to be involved in a mass march, it can really be anybody. It can be a child. It can be somebody who has no formal education. And that's what Randolph actually said, that was what was attractive to him. He said, you know, this is something in which we can involve working people, we can involve anybody from any walk of life. And that in participating in this type of movement, they feel empowered, right? They feel as if, and they really are, changing history, right? This is something that can be empowering to anybody. And I think any of us who have seen pictures of civil rights demonstrations know this is true, right? I mean, the expressions on people's faces, you know, ordinary people are actually actors in history. And what's fascinating, I think, is if you look at the way in which Randolph talked about this March on Washington back in 1941, he saw that very clearly. He said, you know, this is why we need to do it this way. It might work other ways, but this way will actually empower people to take control of their own lives. As I said, A. Philip Randolph was actually largely isolated. Most of the black press, most of the leaders of the major organizations thought he was a little insane at the time. They said, you know, this is going to get us all killed. It was particularly difficult after Pearl Harbor and when the United States actually formally entered the Second World War. People became increasingly hesitant to engage in protest. And in that moment, A. Philip Randolph gained support from a group of young radicals who would remain really at the center of his political activism throughout his life and would really remain sort of critical figures, in many cases largely forgotten figures in the civil rights movement. They included Polly Murray, who's on the far left of this picture, who was a young law student. She would emerge as one of the principal legal strategists of the civil rights movement. In fact, the Brown decision in 1954, which overturned the legality of school segregation, was argued by a team of men, male leaders, with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But they actually, when they talked about their case, they said, yeah, we actually used Polly Murray's writings as the basis of our argument, as what Thurgood Marshall, who would become the Supreme Court Justice, said Polly Murray's book, a book that she wrote in the late 1940s, was their Bible during the Brown decision. She was a young radical who was interested in Gandhian nonviolence. She studied the movement in India very closely. And it was her that actually put together what became known as the March on Washington movement. This was actually a movement that emerged after the March on Washington was canceled. And this was this movement that Randolph talked about, pushing to enforce the order and push for permanent legislation. Another important key figure was Bayard Rustin. who was also, he was a young student. He had been a college student. He actually dropped out of college to become a full-time activist, and also was really sort of interested in this strategy of Gandhian nonviolence. He traveled around the country trying to implement this strategy. In some cases on his own. He literally would get on buses and ride them into the South and stay in the front seat until he would literally be dragged off and beaten half to death. So he started implementing these strategies. Again, strategies that people would start to build on a large basis in the 1960s. He was doing in the 1940s. Finally, I'll mention Anna Arnold Hedgeman. She's the person I think who has fallen out of this history the most. She was actually the only woman on the organizing committee of the 1963 march. And the reason she was there was because she had helped A. Philip Randolph build what was known as the National Committee for a Permanent FEPC. A. Philip Randolph went to her and asked her to chair this organization. It was actually one of the first African-American lobbies in Washington. And it was aimed in the late 1940s as passing this permanent fair employment law. One of the reasons that A. Philip Randolph went to her was that she was an activist in the Black Women's Club movement, and she had connections to communities all over the country, really deep-rooted institutional connections that she was able to implement in this national effort to pass a law. So you see this sort of movement emerging in the 1940s, largely built by young radicals and one older radical, A. Philip Randolph, people who were fairly marginalized and seen as sort of out there and outside of the political mainstream. It's not until the 1950s do you see them able to really turn this sort of inkling of a movement into a mass mobilization. And that was due, I think, to two developments. One, which is fairly well known, which is the emergence of this tremendous mass movement in the South, in places like Birmingham and Montgomery, where you see people challenging the legality of segregation and the system of voter disfranchisement in the South. So people demanding the right to vote, demanding the right to enter into public accommodations equally. And this movement really, for the first time, demonstrated the way in which this strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience could be tremendously effective if carried out in very large numbers. In mass mobilization. It created an alternative to these more moderate civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League. And it also created a situation in which people like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Pauli Murray could start to sort of implement this strategy that they had been recommending for a long time, but people had sort of rejected as crazy. So the most famous instance of this was the bus boycott that erupted in Montgomery, Alabama. And this was a movement that very much built upon this longer history. So the movement, as many of you know, sort of erupted after Rosa Parks refused to give her seat up on a bus. Rosa Parks is often seen as this sort of, she was tired, she didn't want to give up her seat. She, in fact, was a lifelong NAACP activist in Alabama. This is actually, this picture is a picture of her at the Highlander Research Center, which was a center that was a union training school in Tennessee, and in the 1950s, in the early 1950s, really dedicated itself to training civil rights activists. This is actually 2 months before she sat down on the bus, right? So she was clearly, involved in this stuff. Her closest ally in Montgomery was Edgar Nixon, E.D. Nixon, who was a sleeping car porter, and he belonged to A. Philip Randolph's union. His route was actually running on trains from Montgomery to Chicago. He did this every week from the 1930s into the 1960s. He actually helped to build the March on Washington in 1941 in Alabama. So he had been, a part of this movement from the beginning. He immediately called A. Philip Randolph and said, there's something going on here. We need to nurture this. We need to support it. A. Philip Randolph started to raise money in New York, where he lived, also in Chicago and Detroit, and to try to build a mass movement. They also raised money to bring Bayard Rustin to Montgomery to train local activists in this strategy of Gandhian nonviolence. The reason they did that was that there was a wave of violent attacks on activists in Montgomery. Dr. King's house was bombed twice. One time his wife and his year-old child were nearly killed from this bombing. And the immediate reaction of activists in Montgomery was actually to arm themselves, right? So Dr. King applied for a permit to carry a weapon. When Bayard Rustin went to Montgomery to visit and to sort of see what was going on, he talks about going to Dr. King's house. First thing he notices is that there are people sitting on the roof with shotguns protecting the house. He goes into the house, goes to sit down, and somebody says, oh, wait a minute, before you sit down, let's move this handgun. There were guns lying around the living room. And the reason I tell this story is that I think, again, we see this as a sort of spontaneous sort of movement, anybody knows that the sort of immediate reaction to having your house and your family attacked is probably not to sort of turn the other cheek, right? So this was something that was a logical reaction, but people who had been building this movement for 20 years knew that that was not something that should happen, right? I mean, the sort of, if African Americans in Montgomery had started fighting back, it would have really gotten ugly, right? And so the idea was to sort of build a very disciplined, very well thought out organization and movement. And that was something that I think this longer history helps us understand how sort of an important opportunity came along, but it really wouldn't have come of anything really if people hadn't been there to sort of nurture it and bring, I think, a long history of organizing to it. The final link, which I think is important in understanding the success of this movement, was the movement of black trade unionists, which even more than any of these others has really fallen out of the story. And it's the aspect of the story that really brought me to it. It's the thing that caught my attention as something that I didn't know about, and I really wanted to sort of integrate into, I think, a better known story. The March on Washington in 1963, the initial impetus to sort of revive this idea that Randolph had started in 1941 came from an organization known as the Negro American Labor Council. This is an organization, if you go and try to look it up in almost any book on the civil rights movement, you won't find it. If you find it, people will say, well, it sort of existed. It's called a shadow organization, a paper organization. In fact, it was an organization of between 2,000 and 5,000 black trade unionists in cities across the country, including a very vibrant branch right here in Milwaukee. It was a much larger, or it had much more power than those numbers would suggest, because the people who belonged to the Negro American Labor Council were elected officials or staff members of local unions. Most of them were also local officials in their civil rights organizations. So they may be the president of the local branch of the NAACP. So this put them in a tremendous position to actually mobilize people. In some ways, they're similar to the ministers who made up the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King's organization, right? That was also a very small organization. It was a few thousand people. But it was people who, every Sunday went and talked to several hundred people. So they were actually in a tremendous position to mobilize. And in some ways, I think you can see the March on Washington as the coalescence of these two movements. The idea for the March on Washington to revive this idea came in 1962. It was proposed initially by black trade unionists, and their primary concern was a phenomenon that actually Andrew Carl mentioned this earlier, that in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a period of relative economic growth in the United States, there were rising rates of unemployment among African Americans, particularly in northern cities. Actually, it did not hit Milwaukee that early. It would hit Milwaukee later in the 70s. But in places like Detroit, there was actually job loss at a time when the production of automobiles was going up. And the way in which they explained this was the phenomenon known as automation, the idea that machines are taking over, particularly the sort of entry-level jobs that African Americans were getting access to. So this was leading to a situation in which African Americans were moving to northern cities. They were getting access to factory jobs, and those factory jobs were being eliminated. And this was actually the primary and initial impetus for reviving this idea of the March on Washington. A. Philip Randolph proposed a march for jobs that would demand that the federal government do something about this situation. They started to reach out to other African American organizations and try to put together a mass mobilization. And they met a little bit of resistance. I think the most important resistance actually came from Anna Hedgeman, this woman who had headed the campaign for a permanent FEPC. She liked the idea of a march for jobs, but she said, look, there's this massive movement against segregation, for the right to vote in the South. We need to do something about that. And they're not so concerned about jobs. That's not their primary concern. We need to reach out to these organizations. So she actually arranged a meeting between A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King, out of which they came with the slogan for jobs and freedom, the idea that freedom representing the goals of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, for jobs, this movement that had come out of the North. It's interesting that Hedgeman also said, if you're going to build a mass movement, you should probably talk to Dorothy Height, who was the head of the National Council of Negro Women. The National Council of Negro Women at the time was actually the largest black organization in the country. They had roughly 800,000 members. And this was an organization, including Dorothy Height. Dorothy Height had actually been involved in the March on Washington movement in 1941. This organization had been the most consistent supporter of A. Philip Randolph since the 1930s. He didn't listen to Anna Hedgeman. He actually ignored her. He put it off. It actually led to a huge battle within, sort of a behind-the-scenes battle that would, I think, have really important consequences that I can talk about if people want to hear more about that later. One thing that I think is important to keep in mind about the March on Washington sort of as a political event is that it started with, it was started by these black radicals, these two extremely radical movements that were even by in the mainstream of black public opinion thought of as sort of pushing the edges of acceptable political behavior. So this was, again, these radicals in the northern labor movement and the radicals in the southern movement, which, remember, again, Dr. King, this included Dr. King, who was not seen as a sort of mainstream political leader at the time. They later, with varying degrees of resistance, started to win support from more moderate organizations. So these included the NAACP, the Urban League. They also brought some of the more liberal mainstream unions, the United Auto Workers Union, the Garment Workers Union. And they sort of, from this core of radicals, built a really mass mobilization. So I think this long history really, again, helps us understand why it was so successful, why they could actually say, let's march on Washington, and 250,000 people would actually heed that call. Secondly, I think it really clearly helps us understand what the goals of that movement were. And I think we've really narrowed our understanding of what this movement was all about. As I said, it always made a really essential link between economic justice and racial equality. And this was really the central message of this mobilization in August of 1963. They demanded legal equality. They wanted a very powerful Civil Rights Act that would ensure equal access to public accommodations, to public services, to the right to vote. But they also said this would be ineffective without economic justice for all Americans. So they called for what they said at the time, the language that they used at the time, was they called for a permanent FEPC, which was realized in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. It created the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. They also called for raising the minimum wage to a level that would give all workers a decent standard of living. At the time, they estimated that would be $2 an hour. Does anybody want to venture to guess what that would be today if we adjust for inflation? Any ideas? All right, I'll tell you. It would be $15 an hour. And they said that that would be a sort of the minimum basis to give somebody a decent standard of living. They wanted a federal job creation and training program that would put all unemployed workers of any race in what they called meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages. And one thing that was remarkable for me, sort of looking back at the newspaper reporting and the television reporting of this march, is how unavoidable that message was at the time. It was all over the newspaper. The New York Times devoted their entire front section, so the section A, the next day, was entirely devoted to the march. It had, reprints of excerpts from the speeches. It had interviews with sort of everyday people who were at the march, interviews with leaders at the march, analysis of what the more effective demands were, the more effective speeches were. All the major news or television networks carried the entire event live throughout the day. So if you turned on your television, this was the only thing you could see that day. It was one of the first events that was broadcast on satellites to Europe. So Europeans saw it also, live coverage of this event. So it was in some ways a really remarkable sort of public relations success. I mean, it really got the word out. And the central point of it was really front and center. That, as A. Philip Randolph said, A. Philip Randolph gave the opening address at the Lincoln Memorial, as he said, "This civil rights revolution is not confined to the Negro, nor is it confined to civil rights. For our white allies know that they cannot be free while we are not, and we know that we have no future in a society in which 6 million black and white people are unemployed and millions more live in poverty." And one thing that really struck me about the event was, in some ways, this was a sort of classic A. Philip Randolph speech. I mean, he had been a socialist activist by this time for over 50 years. He himself, he was 74 years old at the march. He was a union activist, so you could kind of expect him to say this type of thing. But what was really remarkable is the degree to which his message was repeated over and over and over again by the other speakers. And this, I think, in terms of understanding the meaning of the march, I think it actually helps us understand the one speech that most of us do know, Martin Luther King's speech, which was the last of 10 speeches that were given that day. And it's actually the New York Times the next day remarked that it was actually the least specific of the demands. The New York Times said actually it was ironic that Dr. King, who his house had been bombed, he had been beaten, he had been thrown in jail. He was the person, as the New York Times said, who had suffered the most of all of the people there, and he gave the most optimistic, the most uplifting, and the most sort of forgiving speech. He said, we know this country has gone wrong, but we know that at the core this country is good, right? And I have a dream that we're actually going to reach the ideals that we set out for ourselves at the beginning. As the New York Times said, while he was uplifting, the other ones spoke in harsh and forceful language and focused on the struggle ahead. And if you listen to the other speeches, which are actually very easily available online, you get that sense. They're really angry speeches, and they're really remarkably forceful and very radical speeches, even by people who were far less radical than A. Philip Randolph. He set a tone that was repeated. Almost everybody that day described the civil rights, what we now call the civil rights movement, as a revolution. Right? They said this is going to lead to a dramatic and radical transformation of our country. And that was repeated over and over and over again, to the point that I think it's by the time Dr. King came to the stage, he didn't have to say that. He didn't have to repeat that. Everybody knew what this was about. And anybody who was watching it on television or reading the newspaper the next day would have known that this was a tremendously radical march for jobs and for freedom. Dr. King's job was really to uplift people. This was at the end of a very long day. For most people, they had spent the previous night on buses or trains. People were worn out, and he was there to bring people back, sort of to raise their spirits. If anybody sort of forgot what it was about, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin came back on stage after Dr. King. They read the full list of the official demands, led everybody in a mass pledge to go back to their communities and not stop fighting until they had realized all those goals. So it was, again, there was no chance that you were going to miss this event. I think, or the meaning of this event, I think we've missed it because we only remember one speech. And the one that we remember is the one that was the least specific about what the goals of the march were. In fact, even if you look at Dr. King's speeches, it's the least specific of those. And I think in some ways, it's because he came at the end of this series of incredibly hard-hitting addresses. So I think it also, again, reminds us of what this was all about and what the goals of it were. Finally, I think it really gives us a sense of what the meaning of this demonstration is for us today and what the legacy of this tremendous event was. It's interesting that 2 months before the March on Washington, President John F. Kennedy gave a really powerful speech calling for a Civil Rights Act. He said that he was alarmed by actually the increasing violence in Birmingham. And he went on national television and he said, look, the issue of racial equality is a moral issue. And it's as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. And he said, in a sense, he called on the nation to pass a Civil Rights Act. And this fact has actually led some to argue that the March on Washington didn't really pass this, it didn't have much of an impact because the president had already called for a Civil Rights Act that was passed a year later. And what that forgets is the tremendous impact that the March on Washington had on the nature of the law that was passed. The most important element is that President Kennedy always opposed the idea of adding a Fair Employment Clause to an FEPC law to the Civil Rights Act. He argued that Northern conservatives will vote for a civil rights law that makes it illegal to discriminate against somebody in voting rights in the South, right? Or they'll vote for a law that makes that forces people to integrate Southern schools, but they're not going to vote for a law that tells an employer the type of decision that they can make on their own private property, right? And so this is far too much for us to get pushed through. And that was the central demand. Polls showed that people who were going to the March on Washington, the central, most important issue was their ability to get a job and to support their families. And that was the point that this march really struck home, this connection, again, between economic justice and racial equality. People have made a similar argument about the war on poverty, which is also proposed under Kennedy, but was proposed in a very different fashion from the war on poverty that Lyndon Johnson actually proposed in January of 1964 after a series of very in-depth conversations with the leaders of the March on Washington. And they convinced him of the need to couple a civil rights law with a war on poverty. So I think one thing that we can take away from this is that the contribution of the March on Washington is often seen, I think, as sort of making a moral claim to racial equality. The idea that people heard Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and they were struck by the power of this speech to go, to sort of abandon their racist beliefs. And I think in many ways that there was an element of truth to this. Although if you look at polling numbers, there actually isn't a tremendous shift after the March on Washington in people's views about segregation, about racial equality. In fact, in some ways, it actually hardened segregationist opinion. What I think is more important in terms of the impact of the march is actually prescribing very specific federal policies that can uphold that moral commitment. So in some ways, Kennedy had established that this was a moral commitment. In many ways, the Supreme Court had established that 10 years earlier in the Brown decision, saying that it's unconstitutional to treat people differently according to their race. What the March on Washington did was, if you really want to uphold that moral commitment, you have to have strong federal policies that will ensure people the right to vote, that will protect their right to vote, that will protect their access to public services, that will ensure that everybody has the access to a decent, well-paid job, to decent education, to decent housing. In some ways, it was very mundane. It wasn't sort of uplifting and a moral message. It was very specific. And I think that's particularly relevant this year if we think about what happened. In addition to marking the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington this summer, we saw 3 Supreme Court cases that directly related to issues that were raised at the March on Washington. They had to do with voting rights, with equal employment, and with affirmative action. And interestingly, in each one of those cases, the Supreme Court upheld and affirmed the moral commitment that Kennedy had spoken of. They said, it's consistent with our Constitution, with our legal traditions, to treat people equally, regardless of their race. And in each one of those cases, the Supreme Court struck down the enforcement mechanisms that civil rights activists argued were necessary to uphold that moral commitment. Right? So in some ways, I think we can see ourselves as very much continuing to live in that moment that I think we can think of after the Brown decision, after Kennedy's speech. We have the moral commitment, right? Everybody knows it's bad to be racist. But what do we actually do as a country if we want to ensure actual equality and justice for everyone? I think in some ways, it's tempting to see the March on Washington as the closing of a historical moment in which we ended legal racism, we ended segregation, we affirmed the right to vote. I would encourage us to think of it as the beginning of a moment in which we're still living in which the question is, what is the role of government, of the federal government? What role does the federal government have in ensuring economic justice and racial equality? And what are the links between racial inequality and economic justice that I think are just as sort of staring us in the face today as they were back in 1963? So thank you very much. I actually meant to end with this picture from the 50th anniversary celebration, and this another quote. I can go on and on quoting A. Philip Randolph all day, but here's another particularly prescient one. I'd love to take questions or comments. Yeah.
I was curious if you could speak. My understanding is that Rustin and other activists who were surrounding Randolph had not only studied Gandhi from, like the president of Howard and others who were in correspondence and traveling over, but through the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Did you come across any of this? And if you could speak to those connections to the Protestant church and pacifist attempts.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's true. That for most of the 1940s and into the 1950s, Rustin was employed by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and his connection to Randolph actually also comes through the Fellowship of Reconciliation, because it was headed by Eugene Musty, who was a close friend of A. Philip Randolph's, and they belonged to a circle. It was actually this connection that went beyond the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was really a Protestant, mostly Protestant, but not completely Protestant Christian left that that A. Philip Randolph was also part of this. So A. Philip Randolph, I mean, his father was a preacher. His father encouraged him to go to the priesthood, and he remained a really deeply committed Christian and saw his socialism as growing out of a Christian tradition. And so that's what his connection to, he and A.J. Muste were very close friends and longtime allies, and that's how he actually wrote to Muste and said, "I need some young activists," and he said, "Well, you should talk to Bayard Rustin." So I think that was a really important part of this sort of milieu out of which this movement emerged. It was a left-wing Christian socialist movement that was in the 1930s very sort of broadly spread across the country and effective. Yeah.
Why didn't A. Philip Randolph listen to Anna Hedgeman? You said you'd tell us.
He was a sexist. I mean,
Was there a power struggle?
well, okay, that's basically the answer. But I think there's an important caveat, which is that A. Philip Randolph, and like most labor activists, and a lot of women in the civil rights movement, believed that the most important sort of the priority of their struggle was to put men in the position of being able to earn a living for their families, and that the ideal was to, and that, I mean, remember that this is a time when, particularly for African American women, but not just African American women, the reality was for working class families, women worked, right? They went into the labor force, and they, so the job, or what many union activists saw their job is creating a situation in which women did not have to go into the paid labor force, and they could sort of focus on maintaining a home. It was also the case that many children worked, right? And so they saw their job as creating a situation in which families didn't have to send their children into the workforce. This was a long-standing goal for many union activists. And by the 1960s, only the older men held on to this ideal. Although I should say that there was a really significant debate among black women who were involved in this movement who said, they said, we're not going to really challenge this publicly, because we don't want to undermine the movement. There was actually, Polly Murray actually proposed picketing A. Philip Randolph when he went to publicize the march. She said, we'll have our own protest and we'll go protest Mr. Randolph. And a lot of women said, no, we're not going to go that far. But Dorothy Height actually very vocally said, we support this idea of sort of breadwinning jobs for men. And she said, she actually released a really high-profile report in the months before the March on Washington saying, our primary goal is to put men in a position of supporting their families. And so it was a debate within the movement it was a serious debate. And many of the women, actually, Polly Murray was the first woman to say, this is not going to work, right? Women are in the paid workforce. Many of them are supporting more than their husbands, right? And so we need to actually fight for gender equality as well, and we need to make these, do this at the same time. And it's interesting that Dorothy Height actually, she said, we're not going to go public with this. And a lot of these women said, we're not going to protest until the march. The night after the March on Washington, Dorothy Height called a meeting at the National Council of Negro Women to talk about the problem of sex discrimination in the movement. And at that meeting, this was actually a violation of the official rules of the march, because you weren't actually supposed to have caucus meetings in Washington. And this was when all the men were going to meet with Kennedy in the White House. They went to the National Council of Negro Women, and they planned a series of meetings to talk about this problem. And the first meeting, they invited Polly Murray to give the keynote address. So she's like the most radical feminist in this group, and they're saying, yeah, and we want Polly Murray to tell us how to address this problem. And she gave a speech that actually was reprinted and became a really important document in the feminist movement. She also, when the debate came up over including sex discrimination in the Civil Rights Act, adding it to Title VII. Most civil rights leaders they thought that that would actually kill the bill and make it impossible to pass. She wrote a legal brief arguing why it was so important, and particularly important for black women, to have this sex discrimination prohibition in the law. And it's actually why she circulated it to every member of Congress. She circulated it to President Johnson and his wife. and that actually kept it in the bill. And so I think in some ways the story is one of this really remarkable story of exclusion and hostility to women's leadership. But it's also, I think, a forgotten story as to which this was a really, I think, a pivotal moment in the emergence of the second wave feminist movement. I mean, actually, the end point, or the other part of this, is that Polly Murray and Anna Hedgeman and a number of women who are involved in this are founding members of NOW. And it's actually Dorothy L. Robinson, who I didn't talk about, but who's a Negro American Labor Council activist, is a really pivotal figure in all of these movements. She's the one who says in 1965, we need an NAACP for women. And she happens to say it at a meeting that Betty Friedan was at, and it gets that sort of snowballs out of that. So it's a really important moment, and I think sort of forgotten. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say there are a number of interesting books on about Polly Murray.
Yeah.
Somehow, in the last couple of weeks, she's been mentioned. I was trying to find out where did I just hear someone talking about her and her efforts and giving her credit. It must have been somewhere in the media, but she's a person you really want to read about.
Yeah.
If you have time to come up for air.
Yeah. And actually, I think the best way to read about her is she wrote a lot. She wrote 2 great memoirs, and she wrote legal books that are and articles. But Glenda Gilmore has a great sort of a history of the civil rights movement that focuses a lot on her. Yeah.
So I just wanted to comment. I read your book, The March on Washington, recently. Particularly, I read the notes, the end notes, and then your video.
All right.
And it made me wonder, looking at all the archives that you had visited and the primary sources that you used, what was the experience like for you, tracing a history that you weren't necessarily a part of?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe any particular stories or discoveries of that process that you could share?
Yeah. Well, it was, that's a great question. It's a great experience. I mean, anybody wants to become a historian, I highly recommend it. The pay's not great, but it's great work. The ability to go to these archives. And one thing that was really cool about doing this book is that, it's an incredibly well-researched topic. So there's tons of material on it, and I could read countless books. I mean, about this movement. So what that allowed me to do was actually focus on the archives that have been neglected. So I could, one of the reviewers says that I don't really add anything to the story about Montgomery. There's a guy who wrote a 800-page book about Montgomery. So I wasn't going to add a lot to that, and that was a good thing. What that allowed me to do was to look at archives and sources that people had overlooked. So the most surprising one was the records of the Negro American Labor Council, which again, this is an organization that was a central figure in the civil rights movement. There are several books that describe A. Philip Randolph either as the president of the sleeping car porters, which he was, but that was not his official position at the March on Washington, or say, all of the representatives, all of the speakers at the March on Washington represented mass organizations except for A. Philip Randolph. So it's completely sort of lost in this history, and a really central player. I mean, they're the ones who actually initiated and did most of the early organizing for this march. And there are two incredibly rich collections of papers connected to this organization at the Schomburg Center in New York City. That people have actually used these collections and they cite them, but nobody ever mentions this organization. So that was really fascinating. The other really fun place to do research was the Hoover Institution in Stanford, which is a collection that is dedicated to documenting conservative political thought in the United States. And the great thing that they have is all of these anti-communist organizations that were keeping track of this. So a really good source for doing civil rights history is the FBI, because they were watching everybody really closely. But these conservative organizations were also keeping an eye on everybody and collecting everything. So pamphlets and speeches and everything, and they were sort of documenting this conspiracy to actually create democracy in the United States. and so it's all there. So they have really great records as well. So it was fun because I could sort of go to these places that are sort of obscure and that people haven't really looked at, and use the written, the published histories for what we already know. Yeah.
I haven't read your book, but Martin Luther King, does he play a
Is he there?
big role in your book?
Yeah, he does. Well, I mean, I do focus a great deal on Montgomery because that moment is really important for sort of in the longer context for understanding how these people who are sort of seen as crazy radicals become somewhat, I mean, they don't become mainstream in the broader sense, but for African Americans within black politics, they become sort of accepted sort of leaders of the movement. And King, I think, plays a really funny role in that because on one hand, I mean, he's very young, and he's really, he's not really involved. He's not really interested in politics. So when he moves to Montgomery, he's finishing his dissertation. His first child is born a couple weeks after he arrives. He doesn't know anything about Montgomery because he's from Atlanta, and his wife, Coretta, didn't even want to move back to the South. She's from Alabama, and she's like, I'm not going back to Alabama. So he kind of convinces her to go back. And this movement starts, and E.D. Nixon actually calls Dr. King up and says, and actually he's not even Dr. King yet, right? He hasn't even finished his dissertation. He says, I want you to host this meeting. I want, you're new to town. You don't have any, you're not involved in all the sort of political factionalism of all the ministers. I want you to, and Dr. King's like, no way, I'm not going to get involved. I just can't do it. And then he finally convinces him to host a meeting on the condition that Martin Luther King won't have to be the leader. He says, all right, you can use my church. I'll be there. I'll get some other people to come, but I won't be. And he kind of gets dragged into this very reluctantly. But I think what's interesting for me about watching him throughout this period is the degree to which people really sort of identify him as an important figure and mentor him. I mean, the first one is Bayard Rustin, but it continues with, and actually a lot of these trade unionists who really teach him about the history of the union movement. They connect him with the union movement, so he starts getting these invitations to speak in Chicago and Detroit and New York, and it's always at these union halls, and it's because it's these black trade unionists who are saying, there's this young minister who's a great speaker. Why don't you have him speak? The best is actually the first time he gives the I Have a Dream speech. It's in 1961 when he gets asked to speak to the executive council of the AFL-CIO, which is the sort of the most conservative old guard of the union movement. And they have they're sympathetic in a sense, but they think this guy is a crazy radical. And this is the first time he gives the I Have a Dream speech, and it's it's a remarkable version of it in which he really speaks very powerfully. I mean, his point is to speak to the union movement and say, you have a tradition of fighting for economic justice, and black people are working people, and they share that goal. And so he says, and that's when he says, I have a dream that's deeply rooted in the American dream. It's a dream of prosperity shared equally, of a society in which in which the wealth of society is enjoyed and devoted to the advancement of human possibility. I mean, it's this incredibly eloquent speech that he first gave to the Executive Council of the AFL-CIO. And I think when he gave that speech, he didn't even really, I mean, I think he didn't have much of a connection to these people that he was speaking to. And he was trying to, it was at a time when A. Philip Randolph was really under attack in the union movement. And he was trying to, it was sort of a peace offering, but he gave this remarkable, really remarkable speech. And I think so one thing that I see him happening to him in this moment is he's really transformed. And I mean, he has this incredible speaking power, right? And that's something that he brings with him, you know, from his family and from his home, from the tradition that he comes from. But he gets a political education that's pretty profound, I think, in a very short period of time. Yeah.
Was it not that when King goes to Montgomery, that I understand who a lot of people don't know about is Vernon John, who had been the pastor before King at Dexter Avenue Church. And he was such a radical person.
They ran him out of town.
They ran him out. They didn't want him.
Right.
And so they were out looking for someone who was articulate, but who was not going to be an activist.
Right. Yeah.
Because they had just had enough of this. And it's so interesting how it reversed itself.
Yeah, yeah.
They thought they were just going to have a quiet journey.
Yeah, yeah. And they did, I mean, they made the right choices. Like, they got this guy who came from a pretty prominent family in Atlanta. You know, this guy's probably going to be kind of conservative, and, you know, he's not going to be a rabble-rouser. And he wasn't, really, but he found himself in this moment where people kind of dragged him into this, and he really rose to the occasion. I think, you know, he became... Yeah, Jody.
I wonder if you just comment briefly on sort of maybe the radicalism of the present, something like the jobs of justice movement or the fast food workers movement for a living wage, because there's a kind of, you know, you're up against a change in governance and the growth of privatization and the attacks on organized labor, right? So I wonder if you see a kind of connection of the radicalism of the present that's required to think racial and economic justice together with the radicalism of the history that you gave us for the March on Washington. What do you see when you look at this landscape?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know, is the student who asked the question about talking to people about inequality and how people just don't listen to them, is she here? There was an interesting comment about, and usually this connects to that. And she was expressing frustration with the fact that, you know, you can talk to people about inequality and they'll just argue back at you or give you some. And I think one thing that's really, I mean, that I saw about this movement in doing, I think one of the big takeaways that I got from this research is the importance of these really long-standing institutions and the fact that in a sense it wasn't so much I mean, it was a battle about ideas and about sort of what the way in which we think about the society that we live in. But it was a battle that was fought by institutions, and that institutions connect people to movements that give them power, right? So people are not having these sort of one-on-one conversations. They're part of big institutions that help them sort of articulate a critique of society and actually reach a goal. So, I mean, things like the Negro American Labor Council or the National Council of Negro Women. So I'm not talking about like government institutions, but social movements that had been nurtured over a very long period of time. And I think that in some ways, I mean, I do think that we're in a period in which I think increasingly people are feeling that there's a sort of crisis of society. I mean, we live in, Heather, you mentioned the comparison to the Gilded Age. You know, it's actually much worse now. I mean, if we compare economic inequality now, it's far worse than the Gilded Age. The wealthy today are exponentially more wealthy than the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. I mean, it's really alarming. And one thing that strikes me is that the conversation in the Gilded Age, it was not so much about sort of inequality as what does inequality pose as a threat to democracy? Can you really sustain a democracy? Can we really talk about people having a democracy when we have such economic inequality, right? So does the power of concentrated wealth sort of destroy our institutions of democracy? And that was the alarm. And there was a fairly mainstream conversation about that. And I can see a similar conversation emerging. But I think what's important is the ability to sort of move that conversation through these movements that I think you're right are starting. So the Campaign for a Living Wage actually published an op-ed about how Martin Luther King, I think, really would have supported a living wage. I mean, the demand for a living wage at the March on Washington was the equivalent of $15 an hour. That's actually the number that people in the fast food movement are using. They're asking for a $15 an hour minimum wage. There's also, I think there's a proposal in the Wisconsin legislature to call for raising the minimum wage to $10 an hour. I think these are movements that are very well grounded in institutions like unions, civil rights organizations that are really pushing for these, and I think they have the ability to make a really profound impact. I think there's really exciting things going on here in Milwaukee. I mean, I think the immigrant rights movement in Milwaukee, I think, is really remarkable. I mean, just in the time since I moved away from Milwaukee to now, has really, I think, put Milwaukee sort of on the map as an innovator. The living wage campaign, I think, is a similar thing. So there's really interesting, I think, and promising things going on. I hope they succeed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, a lot of this was educational for me. And one thing that struck me was, in light of how mild, compared to the other speeches given in the '63 March, that King's speech was, why is it that he's labeled, the major threat to America after this? If you have these revolutionary figures speaking more explicitly about what's needed for change, how is he selected? Is it the rhetorical power? Or, I mean, what is it that, if it's not his message, you know what I mean? Why does he become the primary threat to the mainstream status quo?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's not as if the other leaders were seen as sort of safe then. One thing that's interesting is that he, I mean, the way in which we remember King now as sort of this sort of all-revered figure was not seen as, that really emerged after his assassination. The way in which we remember the speech, the I Have a Dream speech, is the sort of encapsulating the goals of the movement. It sort of comes to represent what the movement was all about. That also did not happen so it wasn't seen as his most important speech, or it wasn't seen as the sort of expression of the movement until after his assassination. So I think there was a really a backlash against King. I mean, in the sense that after the march, there was a lot of praise for his speech, and then there's a sort of backlash. I think, as he continues to do what he had always been doing, which was actually, create these mass movements that were provocative, right, and sort of lead to, and really challenging the status quo. So I think that's what led him to be singled out in that way. A. Philip Randolph, he was 74 in '63, so he pretty quickly fades from view. Roy Wilkins, I mean, even Roy Wilkins, if you look at a lot of the newspaper reporting on him in the late 1960s, he's seen as a really radical person. He sort of gets into these tiffs. I mean, the sort of Black Power emerges, and there's this sort of battle over Black Power, and Roy Wilkins and King are very critical of Black Power, and there's this sort of split in that way that sort of casts King and Wilkins as moderates. But in the mainstream, all of these people continue to be seen as radical, and they are. I mean, if you think about the sort of political spectrum in the United States, I mean, these people are all on the left in terms of their sort of social democratic socialists. Yeah.
Didn't King revise his speech very shortly before the...
During.
So he was responding. It was a reaction to...
Yeah. It's really interesting. So he wrote a speech that was kind of in keeping with the sort of jobs and freedom theme. He start in the beginning of his speech is that written speech. So it's the one where he says he is the image of the check that comes back returned insufficient funds. And so it's sort of using an economic metaphor for the sort of equality and justice of the founding documents. But then halfway through, he pushed it aside. The story is that Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, is sitting behind him saying, "Tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream," because he had given that speech at the AFL-CIO, and then he gave it over and over and over again. And he had given it really effectively in Detroit the month earlier. There was 100,000 people marched in Detroit a month before that, and he gave the "I Have a Dream" speech. One story is that that the night when he was writing the speech for the March on Washington, his advisors said, "Don't give that speech, the "I Have a Dream" speech, because you've given it too many times and it's gotten kind of trite. And you need to give a really powerful speech, so don't do that." And so he listened to them, and he wrote this one that didn't have the "I Have a Dream" thing, but then maybe because of Mahalia Jackson, I think he realized it wasn't really working, and so he needed to sort of step up, and he threw out his notes and he gave that. Yeah, it's a great story.
Didn't he give this speech to some young man?
What's that?
That speech, I hear that he'd given that speech to some young man who has possession of it.
Yeah, I've heard that too. It was actually, I think it was like a security guard at the Lincoln Memorial, went up afterward and said, "Can I have your notes?" And he gave it to him, and yeah, I don't know where they are now.
I don't know.
Yeah.
He is holding on to the speech.
Oh, he's holding it. Yeah, smart.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the back. Hi.
Caspi, NAACP Marquette. You mentioned earlier that Rosa Parks went to a training service center before the boycott and everything happened. What training centers, specifically within Wisconsin, but also in general, are around today that train people how to do such things as verbally respond toward bigotry or any other social justice issue?
The training center that she went to is the Highlander. I guess the Highlander Research Center. It's in Tennessee. It actually still exists, and you can go there and learn how to be a radical. And they actually do have they have training sessions throughout the year. There's some funding available for people who want to go there. So it's a really tremendous resource. I don't know of something like that. Does anybody know of something like that in Milwaukee?
Here on campus, we have the Center for Peacemaking, which has a group that meets weekly of undergraduates who study the nonviolence of Gandhi and King, and there's also funding for students over the summer to go participate in different either mentorships or trainings, and if you visit the center, someone would be happy to talk to you about how to access that.
Yeah. There are people. I mean, there's a rich group of people in Milwaukee who have these skills. I mean, people connected to the union movement, people connected to the NAACP in Milwaukee. The Voices de la Frontera is a tremendous organization here in Milwaukee that's doing work around immigrant rights and worker rights. And the leadership of all of those organizations, I think, are people that you can turn to for that type of advice and mentorship. It's great. I hear that there's a new NAACP branch here. That's great news. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think we can wind down. I'm sure that we can hang around for a few minutes, but we've got to get you back to Madison.
Yeah.
I worry about weather.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody for coming out.